All right, and live on Facebook. Greetings, anyone who's tuning in via Zoom. Now we're getting it on the Facebook group. Okay. And coming at us here momentarily. Okay, just double checking to make sure that we are in fact live. Might be something to that Mercury in retrograde. Oh, no, here we are.
Hey.
We are live. I can see it confirmed on the screen. I wanted to make absolutely sure. Okay. Well, welcome everyone to the inaugural week and the inaugural video dialogue for Make Advent Great Again, your pop-up community for resistance and renewal. I'm so glad that y'all could join us this year. We did one of these last year during Advent 2017. So for those of you who were there for that, welcome back. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. It's going to be an awesome 4 weeks as Trip Fuller and I dialogue with Alexander John Shaia and Robin Henderson Espinoza, digging deep into the texts and the rituals and the community forms that have historically helped us find meaning in this season and that oftentimes get lost in the shuffle. And oftentimes, especially in our current climate, can feel like some fairy tale or maybe even actively painful or harmful for us. So we're looking forward to recovering these traditions as genuine and authentic tools to find community, to find ourselves, and just maybe to find God. And so with that in mind, I'd like to welcome Dr. Alexander John Shaia.
Thank you, Michael. Hello, everyone from sunny but snowy Santa Fe. We had about an inch of snow yesterday, so I'm looking out on a beautiful December scene.
That's awesome. And as I was telling Alexander last night, our weather here in Asheville has had a bit of an identity crisis. We also had snow last week, and a couple of days ago we had a 70-degree day. So our weather is trying to find itself.
Yeah.
But if you're not familiar with Alexander, I just want to share a little bit from his official bio, which I endorse 100%. Alexander John Shaia, PhD, is a thoughtful and poetic man, living the ancient rhythms of his Lebanese and Aramaic heritage. With deep conviction, he invites us into a practice of spirituality and Christianity, if we choose, for the 21st century, one that crosses traditional boundaries, encourages vital thinking, and inhabits a genuine community of the heart. Alexander is a spiritual director, an educator, an anthropologist, a psychologist, a ritualist, and a sand play therapist, which if you don't know what that means, maybe we'll get into it at some point. Alexander is a holistic, cross-disciplinary visionary and a passionate professional speaker. He leads retreats, he leads pilgrimages all over the world, and he has released the updated edition of his book, Heart and Mind, The Four Gospel Journey for Radical Transformation, which would make an excellent companion reading for this Advent journey if you're interested. I'll throw a link up in the video here in a bit. But I have followed Alexander's work for years. since an earlier version of Heart and Mind was published, it's definitely been meaningful for me to discern not only individual ways that I can practice spiritual formation and look at transformation molded by the biblical witness, but also looking at how entire communities can be transformed in these practices. So that's who we have with us here. Thank you, and I'll hand it over to you for the moment.
Thanks, Mike. I'm always reminded by one of my teachers that as you get older, the introductions get longer, but thank you. I want to start with situating Advent in the earth and the sky, and then we'll move in a bit to looking at the gospel text of Luke. But it's important for us to remember that when Christianity in the 3rd and 4th century laid out a Sunday reading cycle for the Gospels, the guiding thread for how that was laid out were the seasons in the Northern Hemisphere, and that the texts for Advent were precisely chosen because we in the Northern Hemisphere were in the cold, dark season. And I want to say hello to all my friends and colleagues in the Southern Hemisphere. And I'm hoping that you can find your way into this material. We presented you a challenge in your spirituality, because whereas the gospel texts match the seasons of the Northern Hemisphere, they're off sequence in the Southern Hemisphere. Advent, I think this may surprise people. The primary symbol of Advent is darkness. One way to think about Advent is this is womb time. People often want to wonder where the feminine has gone in Christianity. Well, we have this season called Advent, which is primarily about womb, about our entering once again into the dark womb of God and allowing God to rebirth us. And there are so many things about it. I don't want to make this a history lesson about the season itself. But one of the things I'd like to remind us, which I think might, again, surprise many, Advent used to start on the 3rd of November. It was the entire time from just after All Saints, All Souls into the winter solstice and Christmas. And so it was this enormous time. As we all know in the Northern Hemisphere right now, the days are quite short. We are deep, deep, deep into the dark. And I think almost every spiritual tradition helps us work with darkness, because there's something in our biological DNA that we want to pull back from the dark. I may go all the way back to the times when we were hunted creatures, and in the dark we couldn't see well, and we never knew what beast was out there, and we were potentially the prey to. So I think there's something instinctive in us, or for some of us, that pulls back from dark times. And yet every great spiritual tradition teaches us that darkness is the place where the new radiance begins. Darkness is the place where the new radiance begins. So therefore, if we pull back from darkness, if we pull back from outer darkness, if we pull back from inner darkness, we potentially are harming our spiritual journey, because the Advent teaches us about how to embrace darkness, how to understand darkness as a holy, holy, holy moment, how to understand that when we are in a dark time internally, and when we're in a dark season externally, that potentially that this time is womb time. This is very much the divine feminine of God, from which we might be birthed again, from which new freshness might be birthed again.
Wow. Yeah. I want to pause this right there, because you just said a lot. I think that, for some of us who are coming from evangelicalism in its various forms, whether, Reformed or Baptist or Pentecostal or whatever, the idea of embracing darkness can feel risky, even demonic. Why do you suppose it is that so many of our religious traditions have have shunned the darkness. I mean, I would even argue maybe back to the biblical texts themselves, unless we're misinterpreting them. Was it First John that God is light, there is no darkness at all, or the hymn, there is no shadow of turning with thee? Like, why are we afraid of the dark?
Um, well, okay. It's an enormous question and an important question.
Just
because I
that.
think because well, you're absolutely right. It's like, look at all of our prayers, look at almost all of our prayers and all of our hymns demonize the dark. And I want to suggest that when we demonize the dark, it's a small step to racism, because it's very easy from all the ways that we demonize the dark to put that projection on dark-skinned people.
Wow.
But if we go back to Judaism, our mother, there is no demonization of the dark in Judaism. In Judaism, the dark, the evening, is the face of the queen who comes to bring us rest and nourishment and recreation. There's that beautiful moment at a Shabbat service where the congregation turns to where there's an open door, and they have that beautiful prayer of welcoming the queen of the night who has come to bring us rest. And so where does this duality begin to happen? It begins to happen in Christianity, not in our mother Judaism. and it begins to happen about the 5th and the 6th century. Before that, we are much more into unitive thought. And in unitive thought, we go back to the first words of Genesis, where we understand, where we hear God created dark and God created light, and God saw that both were good. But as we move away from, in my mind, the early theological perspective of Christianity, the first 5 centuries, is very much a perspective of theosis, which is we are made fully in the image of God, and that we are in a gradual process throughout our whole lives of living more into who God has already made us. As the theosis perspective of Christianity begins to de-evolve, the new perspective comes in, which is atonement. And in atonement, we start fighting ourselves and we start fighting creation, because we start from a perspective of we need redemption. Whereas, and I describe theosis as being called by love, and atonement in some way is being pushed by guilt.
Wow. So we need redemption. I mean, for many of us, that is the entire message of Christianity. You're telling me for the first 5 or 6 centuries, that wasn't the primary motif?
That's not the primary motif. You've got nothing in Christianity is simple. But the major motif of Christianity in the first 5 centuries is theosis, and the minor motif in the first 5 centuries is atonement. And then they come into a point where they flip, and atonement becomes the major motif, and theosis becomes the minor motif. And I can understand atonement in some rather beautiful mystical ways, but I think the way that it has come down to us today is almost a caricature of its earliest days. Okay,
so let's before we move on, let's pause here for a second. Again, I'll keep pausing you because there's a lot of rich material here.
Yeah.
For those who might not be super familiar with theosis, I mean, you mentioned it a little bit. My understanding from the Eastern Church is that theosis is the becoming a partaker of the divine nature. It's Athanasius saying that God became human so that humanity might become divine. So it's this sense of taking into ourselves on a practical level the energies of divine love and characters. Is that right?
Yes, and it is that we are made in love. So we don't start from a need to be redeemed. We start from a need to fully enflesh who we already have been made to be.
Okay, so it's a calling ourselves out into to who we are truly created to be.
Yeah, that we're made in love, and that we're called now to consciously do the work of enfleshing love.
Mm-hmm. And what's a practice or two, whether individual or communal, that you have found that helps us to actualize our theosis, or to recognize that it's happening within us?
So another really, really large question. The first is to begin our meditations about how much God loves us, and how much we are able to respond in love. And then from that meditation on I am love and I want to respond to love, to then move to noticing what in us pulls us away from that desire to be more fully who we are. So one of the things that we will look at is we'll look at the four Gospels of this Advent, which in those people who are following the 3-year church cycle of reading the Gospels on Sunday morning, this Advent is dedicated to the Gospel of Luke, and 4 Gospels from Luke, which are going to tell us about how we begin to understand that we are seeking to be people of love, and we are seeking to serve others in love.
Mm. Awesome. So your answer to the question of what practices can help root us in this are: stay tuned, be part of this community here, and let's dive into these texts together.
Yeah, because otherwise I'm just giving sort of some simple platitudes, and I don't want to do that. I want it to really ground us in this Advent, for those who are following the lectionary cycle or the reading cycle, the gospel text of this Advent and the spiritual practices that they give us.
Perfect. So ideally, we will begin to recognize theosis as a part of this next month together. It sounds like.
Yeah.
And so that's the goal. Oh, go ahead.
No, go.
That's the goal. And for those of us who are recovering fundamentalists of various stripes, what would probably be lovely in the meantime is to have a little bit of a cognitive grasp on this beautiful mystical understanding of atonement. Even if it's in its proper place, meant to be the minor key, could you play us a note of that key?
Well, just look at the word and break it apart at one moment. That atonement is another way to understand that we are moving into a oneness with who Jesus the Christ is, which means that matter and divinity are brought together as one. And that our work in our life is to do the work, to move through our weaknesses, to understand that Jesus the Christ is giving us the opportunity to see that matter and spirit in us is already one.
Wow. That sounds like a way to talk about theosis again, but I like it.
Well, let's even to take the great metaphor of the blood of Jesus, is to understand that blood in the metaphor is the life force, and the life force is the place where matter and spirit come together. And that Jesus the Christ shed his blood that we might understand the unity between divinity and matter in us.
Okay. I'm going to chew on that.
Yeah.
So let's continue moving forward then. So we're if we can avoid the sort of dualisms of the last 1,500 years or so that wish to divide out light and darkness and bury the darkness and always be about the light, and then we get really kitschy praise and worship songs as a result, and faith, when it's no longer a Santa Claus God, tends to fall flat for us, and then we think, well, gosh, what were we doing? How does Advent, and maybe how does specifically the text even this week speak to that?
Okay. I want to add a word, because you're going to hear me use the word, and that is I rarely ever talk about light and dark. The word that I use is radiance.
Mm.
And the reason I like radiance, and I think that if we go back into the Greek in the Gospels, you will find in the word phos something that's more like radiance than something that's flat like light and dark. Radiance has light and shadow and movement. It's dynamic. When I think of radiance, I think of a lot of candles lit in the dark, where I can see both the dark and I can see the light, and I can see how they play together. To me, there's something absolutely mesmerizing about watching candles burn, or watching a fire in a fireplace, etc. But it has movement and dynamism, and so you'll hear me talk a lot about radiance and fresh radiance.
Okay, I like it.
Now, let's look at the gospel text for those. Let me back up, and I don't want to do too much history, Mike. So
I think we like history here. We're nerds.
Well, keep me honest here.
Okay.
For between the 4th century and the 7th century, Christianity knew that the Gospels were a journey, and they had a sequence, and they were only read in this sequence. And people understood that the Gospel of Matthew was about the journey to begin again, and the Gospel of Mark was about after you begin again, you go to a place that's sort of wild and woolly. And then out of that wild and woolly, and we might even say dark place, comes the new radiance of John. John is that moment where the new radiance in us bursts forth. And then following that is Luke, because the new radiance, if it's not brought into our daily life and practice, is stillborn. And so Luke was, how do we walk very practically in our service to ourselves and our communities with this new radiance? So our early ancestors, in my mind, fully understood that these 4 texts were not 4 different images of Jesus, but that these 4 texts were a continuous story of how Jesus lives in us. And the way that I describe it is the Gospel of Matthew is Jesus's teachings about how we face change. And the Gospel of Mark is Jesus's teachings about how we move through trials and obstacles. And that the Gospel of John is Jesus's teaching about new radiance and what that means for us, or what I call joy. And the Gospel of Luke and Acts is about how we mature as we seek to be of service.
So in other words, yeah. Rather than being 4 biographies of Jesus, it's more like these are the 4 catalysts to the continuing adventures of Jesus in and as us in our communities.
Absolutely. And that the early church understood the 4 as sequenced, because it's the way grace moves in us, or it's the way Jesus works with us, whichever piece of language helps you most understand this. So one of the first things that just stunned me was when I began to see this pattern, is that where Matthew's text ends in the inner journey with Jesus is where Mark's text opens. And where Mark's text ends is where John's text opens. And where John ends is where Luke opens. And where Luke Acts ends, spins us back around again to the beginning of Matthew. All right. All of that is to say that in the last half of the 20th century, many Christian churches recovered this 3-year cycle of reading the Gospels. And when they did that, each of the 3 years was dedicated to one Gospel. So the first year of the cycle was Matthew, and the second year of the cycle was Mark, and the third year of the cycle was Luke. And you say, well, what happened to John? John got the 100 days every year of Lent Easter. All right. But what's important for us in our discussion is that we have 3 different Advents. We have Matthew's Advent, we have Mark's Advent, and now this year we have Luke's Advent. So all the Lucan gospel texts are going to be, all the Advent texts this year are going to be from Luke. And they have a pattern to them. Over all 3 years, the 4 Sundays have a pattern. And the first Sunday, yesterday, the first Sunday of Advent is about wake up or be aware. There are many things about that. One is just be aware the church year has changed, the gospel has changed, but it's more important about wake up in yourself to a new question, to a new experience. And where do you wake up? You always wake up in the dark time, because in Christianity, continuing from our Judaism, our new year, our new moment, our new day is always when darkness falls. And this is one of the most profound teachings of the Advent season, as it is of the Christian year, that we come to appreciate that darkness is not the end time, that darkness is the beginning time. And darkness is not the place where God is not. Darkness is actually the profound place where God recreates us. And so the first Sunday of Advent is always about wake up, be aware, you're now in a dark time. And the second and third Sundays of Advent are always about John the Baptist or John the Witness or John, son of Zechariah. And I always do that because each gospel gives John a different name. And we tend to just call it John the Baptist. And Luke is going to call him John, son of Zechariah. And the second and third gospels, through the story of John, give us the spiritual practices that we must begin to work on as we seek to grow in service. And then the fourth Sunday of Advent is either a story of Joseph or a story of Mary, which shows us the fruit of our practice of that year, Advent. And Advent becomes the prologue to all the spiritual work that we're going to do the rest of the year through this gospel.
So right. It's really like our new year inauguration.
Yeah.
Now, as aspiring.
Week 1, wake up. Weeks 2 and 3, this year, John, son of Zechariah. And I love that name because John, son of Zechariah reminds us how he divested himself of privilege to be of service. And the fourth Sunday, we're going to have the Magnificat. We're going to have the story of Mary, which just is powerful. And I'll hold that for deep in the season. But there is no more powerful and beautiful text in all of the four Gospels than Mary's song. So, do you want to stop me, or you want me to go on for a moment?
I'll just pause and kind of share some thoughts. As you're describing, again, growing up in from low church to basement church traditions, using the lectionary cycle was not first nature. Has been for the last several years of my church life. But as you're describing, the year of Matthew, the year of Mark, the year of Luke, it kind of reminds me of the Chinese years, like the year of the dragon, the year of the tiger, that we can sort of see ourselves as under these signs. And so, just spitballing here for a moment, what is the Celtic animal associated with Luke? On the crest.
The ox.
The ox.
It's the ox. And why? Because the ox is the beast of burden built for the long, hot work of day. And when Luke talks to us of service, Luke is always bringing us to 2 points. First of all, I want you to only think about today, Christians. Don't think about tomorrow. Don't think about next week. Don't think about a year from now. Because if you do, the work is so enormous that if you start going down that road to tomorrow, you're going to exhaust yourself. You're going to get cynical. You're going to get bitter. Luke keeps bringing the question back. What small part of God are you serving today? Today. And the second piece of that is that he does bring this image of the ox, which has enormous strength. It is really built for the long work ahead. So Luke has got this paradox of, we know that we're in a long work, and many of us don't know when there's going to be a turnaround. But Luke keeps saying, Jesus the Christ is here. There is going to be a turnaround, and you don't have to fight the war or the battle.
Mm.
All you have to do is you have to pick up the small part of service that God has put in your heart today.
Mm.
So it's going to be part of what we'll see over the 4 Sundays of this Advent. Is this Advent is asking us. We all have our mailboxes are full, our inboxes are full with requests to act. What is God asking you to do in the way that will not exhaust yourself to bitterness and cynicism?
Mm. What does it take to take on that easy yoke and that light burden?
Exactly.
Mm. Wow.
So,
yeah, I'm still stuck on the symbol of Luke in the Book of Kells. The ox perfectly corresponds with your Quadratus reading of the Gospels. It's almost like you're not making this up.
I'm not making this up, and of course, the 4 beasts associated with the 4 Gospels comes from Ezekiel's vision. That Matthew was associated with the angel, and it's like, I know there's a lot of beautiful angelology, but in the scriptures, when an angel arrives, it's like, whoops, it's like, oh my, a new journey is starting. Why else does the angel come? And the first thing the angel always says is, "Be not afraid." In the scriptures, Mark is associated with the lion, which is the nobility of a certain type of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And John is associated with the eagle, which is the high-flying visionary. And then Luke with the ox, which is bring that vision back down to the ordinary work of day.
Wow. That's
visionary.
Yeah, it's very visionary. That's really cool.
And then Luke with the ox. I love to be taught again.
Yeah.
So let's if you're ready, let me just do a little bit of the historical soil that Luke wrote his gospel on, because this also, I think, is so much part of my work. And you have named, the word that I use for my work is quadratus, which is how these four stories actually form one story. But Luke is written, we believe, in the 80s of the first century. And what's happened at this moment is we've had this incredibly painful mutual separation from our mother Judaism. Actually, it's a very, very painful divorce on both sides. And because of that, and we can talk later about all the things that lead up to that moment, but what happens in that moment is because the Roman emperor now has to understand that we are not part of the Jewish tradition. We are a new tradition. And we're evangelical, which means we're one of the first traditions, if not the first tradition, which is going beyond tribe and saying to everyone, it no longer matters what your mother's blood was. We have a table. And whether you're from the eastern provinces or the western provinces, whether you're from Africa or whether you're from India, it doesn't matter, come. It doesn't matter whether you're male or female, come. It doesn't matter whether you're free or slave, come. Well, this struck terror in the heart of the emperor, because the emperor liked his empire squabbling with each other. Any idea of a religion that was going to say we're all brothers and sisters and we have an obligation to live as brothers and sisters was flying in the face of the emperor's values. So the emperor makes us criminals and then very quickly begins to lead to execution. Luke now is going to write his text, which I believe is one of the world's first great texts of nonviolent resistance. Because through Luke Acts, Luke says to us, we know what happened to Jesus the Christ, and we know what happened to Peter, and we know what happened to Paul, and probably we're all on that same road. But there is something greater to live for than just simply my own pleasure and my own comfort seeking. That, yes, we want to create a new type of human family. And we understand that the emperor is going to oppose us. We understand that his opposition may even mean our death. But even in the face of that, we will not demonize him. We will not demonize anyone. We will accept the small works of service and the oppression and the punishment for that, because we want to change the empire by changing one heart, one heart, one heart, one heart, one heart, one heart. For 235 years, Christians following the text of this gospel sought to change one heart, one heart, one heart, rather than seeking to impose any large systemic change. They understood that the only real way of transformation is conversion of the heart to a new way of living. And ultimately, 235 years later, the Roman emperor fell because we had changed the ethos of the empire. We had changed enough hearts of the people in the empire that such oppression could no longer stand. Anyway,
yes.
so Luke wants to tell his story on the backdrop of the fact that Christians at the end of the first century are few, they have little resources, we're somewhat unorganized, and we're up against the greatest power that the world has ever known. And who would ever believe that there could be a turnaround? We had no power, except we had the power of truth and the power of the presence of Jesus the Christ. And so Luke is the gospel that gives us the historical time of when Jesus is born. But Luke isn't giving us the historical time because he wants us to know history. He's given us the historical time. Now, who's the emperor? Augustus Caesar. Who's the governor? Who are the priests in the temple? He's giving us that moment in time because to the Jewish understanding, and the Jewish people would hear those names and they would know that this was a wall of shame. That they were up against an emperor and a governor who saw them only as property. And perhaps even harder for them, they knew that in the last days of the temple, that the priests had become stooges of the emperor to line their own pockets with gold and to get the temple regilded while they starved. While they didn't have money to feed their children, the priests were charging exorbitant fees for animal sacrifice at the temple and telling people that only if you had more money to give could you have access to Yahweh. Now, I want to stop for a moment, and I realize that this is the first morning of Hanukkah, and I want to wish, if we have any Jewish brothers and sisters with us, I want to wish them a really holy and blessed time of these 8 nights. And I want to assure them I am not talking about Judaism today. I am talking about a very low moment in Judaism, which, as many people have written, a lot of Christianity is right there now. That what happened at that moment is something that almost every world tradition has had a moment like this low moment in Judaism in the first century, where the temple institution turned against spirituality. They moved through that, and they rebirthed their tradition in an incredibly magnificent way. And it gives me hope that Christianity can move through this moment and we can rebirth our tradition in an equally magnificent way.
So wait, are you saying that right now you feel like Christianity charges exorbitant fees for access to God and engages in cronyism and oppression? What?
I'm saying that there are elements of that in our tradition right now.
Yeah, no, I think in all seriousness, it's important that you name that. I think that a completely unintended side effect of the Gospels being written in the time they were, where the early Jesus followers, the early wayfarers, are this minority of a minority faith, and they're experiencing, a certain level of oppression from their former co-religionists, and then, of course, a heaping ton of oppression from the empire, that sometimes and oftentimes history is sadly borne out, we crystallize that moment in time, and it becomes a form of unconscious anti-Semitism, where we're like, oh, those Pharisees, as though
exactly.
Jewish people are always, the bad guys, and it's astonishingly ignorant of, the grand sweep of Jewish history and practice.
Right, and what I try to describe is that the Pharisees had a bad hair day, a really bad hair day that got locked into our scriptures. Whereas the Pharisees are the heroes to the Jewish people. They were the ones who kept Judaism together after the temple was destroyed and the priests were massacred. And they led, over 150 years, they led to the birth of the rabbinical movement, which holds Judaism to this day. And so they had an anxious moment, and who can fault them?
Right.
After the temple was destroyed and the priests were massacred, and they were fighting for what they believed was, they were fighting against the death knell of their 2,000-year-old tradition. Sound familiar?
Yeah. Right. What do we do when we're under pressure and feel like we're losing our relevance,
right.
or our existence? It's a
right.
real test of character.
But they moved through that moment rather quickly. Unfortunately, when our Gospels are written, we're in a struggle with them. Which it's not the Pharisees during the time of Jesus, it's the Pharisees at the end of the first century who are so anxious about Judaism and struggling to find the way forward.
Mm, mm. Yeah. So this is the water that the Gospels are swimming in, and then especially Luke, like what you were saying earlier about that change one heart. There was no way they could have thought systemically, even if they wanted to, being such a minority movement. It really was a changing of the hearts. And you mentioned it takes, 200 years and some change before the entire empire embraces at least a form of Christianity. And I think for, those of us who are deconstructing our faith, or maybe we come from radical Reformation traditions, Anabaptist, Quaker, etc., it's easy for us to dismiss Constantine and Constantinism, and rightfully so in many ways. But I think that it also is important to sort of empathetically place ourselves in the shoes of these early Christians. Like, suddenly they're no longer being persecuted. Suddenly they're being welcomed into a wider participation in society. And I doubt there are very many of us today who wouldn't see that as some amazing opportunity. And before we're so quick to judge, I think it's important to acknowledge that.
It's true. And I mean, as a psychologist, I know that the moment that the oppression begins to lift off of us is a very dangerous psychological moment, because it's very easy for us to move from the oppression and the persecution to ease, that then subtly we might become the oppressors.
Mm. Mm.
I'm wondering if this is a moment to read the gospel text of yesterday, and to hear it, as I'll open it up, to hear it through the context of what the early Christian body of the late first century is wrestling with. Why Luke has given them the words in this way.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Would you like me to read it?
Sure.
Okay. So the gospel text for this first week of Advent comes from Luke 21:25 through 36. And here it is. And this is...
And Mike, let me just stop you right there, because the very next chapter, Luke 22, starts the Passion story. So we understand this text that you're about to read is very, very late in Luke's gospel.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and the context of this, I believe, is the followers of Jesus asking, what are the signs of your return, or what are the signs of the end?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is Jesus speaking. There will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and on the earth distress among nations, confused by the roaring of the sea and of the waves. People will faint from fear and foreboding of what is coming upon the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud, with power and great glory. Now, when these things begin to take place, stand up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Then Jesus tells us a parable. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. As soon as they sprout leaves, you can see for yourselves and know that summer is already near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you will know that the reign of God is near. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Be on guard so that your hearts are not weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of this life, and that the day will catch you unexpectedly like a trap. For it will come upon all who live on the face of the whole earth. Be alert at all times, praying that you may have the strength to escape all these things that will take place and to stand before the Son of Man.
And I reached for the Bible that I've got on my computer because I just want to reprise a short line from the end there.
Mm-hmm.
Be on guard so that your hearts are not weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness, and that the worries of this life and that day does not catch you unexpectedly like a trap.
Mm.
And I think that in some ways is Luke's theme song. His gospel, this Advent, is going to be about our prayer that we will dig deeper for the grace of service, that we want to serve our families, we want to serve our communities, we want to serve ecology, we want to serve the planet. But Luke is already saying here in this first Sunday, I want you to go through a process of weaning your service. I want you to listen deeply to what God has put in your heart. I want you to commit yourself to one or two things of service that you can do without exhausting yourself, that you can do without becoming cynical or bitter. But I also want you to remember happiness and joy and ease and beauty. That this text, very late in Luke's gospel, reprises so many of his messages throughout the text about the life of service is not a life where we put on a dour burden, but we become, in some ways, the happy warrior. And the happy warrior is because we need to root ourselves in God's heart, which means we know that if each of us does our small part, God will take care of the rest.
Yeah.
So this Advent is going to be the question of what's your small part?
Okay. Yeah. That is so for those of you, tuning in, what small part can you play over this next year? What act of service can you give from within that does not exhaust you, that does not drain you, but that is a way that you can reflect this theosis, this partaking of the divine nature.
Right. And I want to, you earlier asked about a small spiritual practice, and I want to suggest one here that we're leading towards. And it's like to use these 4 Advent Gospels to reflect on what in us needs to be strengthened or reborn. And then in the little Advent Christmas videos that the Work of the People are putting out right now, I suggest this practice, and that is, I start in my house by having the small Christ child in a manger scene. But very quickly, after a few days, I take that baby out of the manger, and I begin to put there the spiritual practices that I'm hearing God put on my heart. That baby in the manger had its birth 2,000 years ago. Thank God. But the question now is, will I birth a spiritual practice or two in my life through this season that will also offer that grace to the people around me?
That sounds like a reprisal of something Meister Eckhart said, something to the effect of, Christ was born 2,000 years ago, but if I don't allow the Christ to be born through me, then what good is that?
Amen.
So let me make sure I understand the practice that you personally follow and that others could be invited to do. You have a manger scene in your home, and you have Jesus in the manger, but then you actually replace the figurine of Jesus with some practices. Am I understanding you correctly? Like you write them down.
That I have that empty manger, if you will. And I am wanting through the Gospels of Advent and Christmas to listen deeply to what God has put on my heart as spiritual practices for this year. One or two. And I write those down on some beautiful paper. And I fold those up, and I might have friends, or if I'm part of a family, to fold those up and to put that in the manger scene. Maybe to put the child Jesus on top of it, but to remember that the manger is not there only to help us think back, but the manger is there to awaken today and tomorrow. What will we do so that the grace of Jesus the Christ might live deeper in me and in us?
So that open manger is a symbol of that question.
Yeah.
Wow, very cool. And I think I want to try that with especially with my two children. I think that would be a beautiful sort of physical representation of the question that we can be asking with under the sign of the ox, Luke's Advent. Beautiful. Well, so if you don't mind sharing, you don't have to, but what would be an example of some of these practices that have occurred to you in years past when you've done this? I'm still trying to wrap my mind around what all practices could be.
Well, for myself, I always try to think of an internal practice, some virtue or quality that I'm working on, and an external service.
Got it.
So, I mean, a few years ago was a very difficult year. A lot of emotional betrayals happened in my life. And so I was really I really placed in the manger that year my desire to begin the journey of forgiveness. And I always think about, I'm not obligated to complete the journey of forgiveness. I'm only obligated to start it. and to pray for the grace to keep going.
That's a helpful way to think about it.
Equally, there's one political cause that I have put my heart to, and I know that there are many worthy causes out there, and but I've dedicated myself to go deeply into this one.
Okay.
And with the work that I do with that one, I pray that all of us might be awakened to find the cause or two that I want to give to.
Yeah, it's so valuable. Awesome. Wow. Well, I feel like there's so many more places we can go, and this might be a good pausing place for this week. Are there any other things that you would want to share with us as we embrace this week?
I'd like us to remember and to pray with our Jewish brothers and sisters. This is the week of Hanukkah, and Hanukkah always falls in the month of the least sun and the week of the least moon. So we all this week are, if we're in the Northern Hemisphere, we are in the time of the deepest dark. And that in the time of the deepest dark, our Jewish brothers and sisters remember the prayer that all might live free. And I love the beautiful song of Hanukkah, the prayer that all might live free, and that tyrants might be disappearing.
Mm.
And I would just ask you perhaps to join with our mother tradition and to pray those words or sing those words. On my Facebook page last night, I put up a video of that song, which is Rock of Ages. And it's a song that we need to bring into our hearts this day, in this season, in this cultural time.
Mm. I love that. Okay. Wow. Well, thank you for unpacking Advent for us in this way. I know it's just the first steps along a journey, but I know I feel enriched, and I hope that those of you tuning in do as well. Stay tuned. You'll be receiving written reflections from Alexander and from Robin Henderson Espinoza as we enter these coming weeks. There will be a video dialogue between Tripp and Robin later this week. And for those of you who have asked about the Make Advent Great Again caps, they are still available. So I will put a link up for that if you too would like to signal your subtle and not so subtle subversion this holiday season. But thank you, Alexander, for being here with us this week.
You're welcome, Mike. And can I I'm going to hold up. I know you're going to have a link to this, but this is the book.
Yep.
It's a big book, but this might be a great time to just dip into the Luke section.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll put links up in the Facebook video notes for Alexander's book, The Work of the People video that he described, and the Make Advent Great Again cap, because
cool.
This is America. It's we have to integrate. We can't be dualistic here about the material realm and what we're pursuing. So awesome. All right.
Blessings, everyone. See you next Monday.
Yes, absolutely.
All right.